Hello everyone, my name is Jonty Leibowitz and I'm from a think tank, heard them say, called the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, based in Manchester in the United Kingdom. And I'm going to tell you today a bit about our work, a bit about what's gone on in Preston, and some of the new ideas in municipal government and local government that are beginning to emerge in the UK. As you will have noticed, I'm speaking in English and not Swedish, and I always feel very embarrassed as a Brit when we come over to Europe and we basically can't speak any European languages, so very sorry about that. If I'm speaking too quickly, then please put up your hand and go like this. And if there's anything, if I use a term that you completely don't understand and it's meaning that you can't understand what I'm saying, then put your hand up and I'll come to you. I'm going to try and speak slowly and in a way that explains across the language barrier. And then I'll talk for a bit and then we'll have some questions at the end. Is that okay? Yes. Is the pace I'm talking at slow enough? Yes. I don't mean to be condescending because like everyone I've met so far speaks such good English, but it's good to check. So first of all, it's wonderful to be here. I've never been to Sweden before, and I was looking at a map of where we are at the moment. I don't think I've ever been this far north on the globe, and it's absolutely beautiful here. So it's a real pleasure to be here, to explain some of our ideas and just to listen really. And I was listening as best as I could with some translation at the back. Oh, it's just gone. That's the end. Okay, now it's more like a concert. And I thought what was really interesting from what I heard at the beginning from Serena, I mean, first of all, it's great that your government is here and listening to organizations such as yourselves and being interested in these issues. Our government in the UK would not turn up for something like this at the moment. You might know a bit about our government. And we might have a new government next week, but we probably won't. And what I found really interesting about what Suna said was that there are some differences in that our government probably wouldn't turn up to an event like this because they don't care. But there are also lots of similarities between what's happening in local economies in Sweden and what's happening in local economies in the UK. And what I heard, or what I think I heard from Serena, was there's an awareness now in the way we talk about the economy in places like Sweden and in the UK, that it's basically not working for the majority of people. That when we talk about the economy as a construct, it's removed from our everyday lives, and it's not creating social justice and economic justice and environmental justice for most of our people. And obviously this conference, what you're talking about here at this conference is the sort of geographical dimensions of that, and how what it sounds like economic development in Sweden for quite a long time has left behind predominantly rural areas in Sweden. And that idea of the left behind and those who've been left behind by economic development is obviously one that's here in Sweden, it's over in America, and it's also very much in the UK. And I'm going to tell you a little bit, I'm going to give you some statistics about what's going on in the UK, but you won't be surprised to know that we have very similar issues now in the United Kingdom. What we have in the United Kingdom now is an economic system that is completely divided. And it's not divided between urban and rural, as it might be here in some ways, but it's divided between the very small group who benefit from the way that the economy is structured, and then everyone else. And those everyone else are in our urban areas, they're in our suburbs, they're in our rural areas, and they're in our sort of small cities, big towns, or municipalities, as maybe you call them here. And so my organisation, the CLES, the Centre for Local Economic Strategy, we've been working for about 35 years. I've not been there the whole time because I'm not 35. But we've been working for about 35 years on trying to come up with ways that we can develop local economies in the United Kingdom in a different way, so that there's more social, economic, and environmental justice in our local communities and local economies. And it's interesting, I was looking up, I can't say the name of the organisation, Helgeth Sverige. I was looking up the website and going on Google Translate and reading about the organisation. And it's very similar to our organisation in the way that we both talk about the economy. So we at CLES, when we talk about economics and the economy, we take it from the Greek word oikonomos, which for any Greek speakers amongst you means keeper of the household. And it was this idea that the economy essentially was about everyday life. It was about how we all lived our lives. And we at CLES believe that we've gone too far in the way we develop, in the way we talk about economics, away from that original idea of keeper of the household. So when we talk about the economy these days, we talk about things that are totally abstract to the majority of people, such as GDP, national balance sheets, national debt, and all of those things, of course, are important. But what's really important is how people actually live their lives and what people actually need to get on and live a good life. So I won't talk too long about this slide because you already know it, but basically all this slide means is we're in a crisis. We're in an economic crisis and we're in an environmental crisis, and that's playing out now on an international global level. And of course, Sweden is responsible for giving us one of the most inspirational figures of our time, Greta. And but it's also, so it's an international crisis, but it's also a hyper-local crisis. So in small places like Preston in the north of England, or Järvsö, where we are now, I think I said that right, we're beginning to see manifestations of this economic and ecological crisis. And that's obviously very daunting because it's a crisis, but it's also exciting because people are now beginning to realize that we're in a crisis and trying to do things differently. And that's, of course, what all of you are doing. And that's beginning to happen in the UK. This was a big campaign run recently, and it says capitalism, time for a reset. The idea that essentially capitalism's gone crazy in the UK. And this was run by the Financial Times. Does anyone know the Financial Times in the United Kingdom? They're hardly like a left-wing newspaper. So when even the Financial Times is saying that there's something fundamentally wrong with the British economy, and indeed all economies, then maybe it really actually is. So again, I'm not going to spend lots of this time going over what's wrong with the economies, but I said before, one of the big problems we have in the UK is that wealth, who owns wealth and power in our countries, is dominated by a small elite. And you probably would have seen this already, but we as a global society live in a world where 8 richest men have the same wealth as 3.6 billion people. They're all men, they're almost all American, and for the eagle-eyed amongst you, you'll notice that this man, Michael Bloomberg, has just decided that he wants to be president and is basically buying his way to doing it. And we have a similar problem in the United Kingdom. So in the United Kingdom, it's 5 men have the same wealth as 30 million people. And what's particularly shocking about the United Kingdom is in the 1950s to 1970s, we didn't have this American-style super rich and super inequality. We had an economy that was a bit more like a Swedish economy or a German economy or the economy of the Netherlands. It was essentially a mixed social democracy with taxation, redistribution, welfare provision, and those sorts of things. Then in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher happened, you might know about. And then in 2010, austerity happened. If I say the word austerity, people, is that a new one? So basically we had the global financial... So we basically had the global financial crisis in 2007, as you all know. And in 2010, a new government came in the United Kingdom that basically said the way that we're going to solve this economic crisis is we're going to do the biggest rolling back of the state in British history. So they cut social security, they cut hospital fee funding, they cut school funding, they cut all pieces of the public sector. And at the same time, they gave big tax breaks to companies and to private individuals. And the hope was this old Reagan idea that the wealth would trickle down, up through business, down to everyone else. People familiar, trickle down economics, that phrase? Good. And surprise, surprise, 12 years later, it didn't happen. So here we are 12 years later in the United Kingdom, and the number of billionaires in the UK has doubled in the last 12 years. But for everyone else, life has become a lot more difficult. So, I mean, I don't know if anyone's been to the UK recently in this room, but you see a lot more homeless people on the streets of major cities in the UK. And homelessness is the highest in a generation. We have 3 million people in the United Kingdom now using food banks. So a food bank is if you can't eat, you need to go and take food from a charity. We have 14 million people in the United Kingdom in poverty, and about 4 million of them are children. And also our property market is totally broken in the UK. So I don't know if any of you have ever tried to rent a flat in London or Manchester, or even get an Airbnb, but don't. It's a disaster. And a UN report in 2019 basically commented on this extreme poverty we now have in the UK, that this was not just an accident, but it was actually a product of government policy and a social disgrace. And what they meant by that is that since 2010, government's policy in the United Kingdom has basically been to cut social services and just try to grow the economy by giving out tax breaks to the very rich and the very wealthy. And it basically hasn't worked. And as you can see here in the United Kingdom, the rich are getting richer. So at the top, inequality levels have rocketed in the last few years. This is 2010 to 2015. So the UK has moved away from being like countries like Sweden, which is a more equal country often, and we've got this hyper inequality now in the United Kingdom. I don't know about it. Are there any questions about that so far, about the United Kingdom context and what's happening to the UK? No, I think it's relatively understandable. That's good. So part of the problem with economic development in the United Kingdom is that the government, as I said, their view about how we do economic development has essentially been cut taxes for the rich and hope they set up a business, or if that's not the answer, then try and get a big company to come in. So try and get an Amazon or a Google to come in. And the problem with that, as many of you will know, is that that doesn't really generate wealth for ordinary people in ordinary communities, because the profits go up and out and away to the shareholders. So they go to Mr. Bezos or Mr. Zuckerberg, for example. And the challenge really for localities in the UK is how can you try and grow the economy in ways that keeps wealth anchored in the local economy, so it actually stays in a local economy, so that when you have a local area and you try to grow the economy of that area, you're actually making sure that the wealth that's produced in that place stays in that place for local people and local residents. And really what we're talking about, and what I'm going to talk about in the rest of the talk, is a new way of trying to do that has emerged in the United Kingdom in the last 10 years. A new way of trying to grow the local economy in places that keeps wealth in it, rather than the wealth being extracted out. And I'm going to start doing that by talking about the most famous place where this has happened, which is Preston. So for those of you who don't know Preston, it's a town in the northwest of England. It's got a population of about 130,000, so it's relatively big, but not particularly big by United Kingdom standards. And it was a big part of the Industrial Revolution with cotton, but since the industrialization, it's really economically suffered. And the government's idea, time and time again for Preston and places like Preston, is, well, just get a big company to come in and set up a big shop or a big factory, and then there'll be jobs for local people and the economy will grow. And they kept doing it over and over again, new shopping centres, new factories, whatever, and it didn't work. Wealth wasn't staying for local people, it was going up and out of the Preston economy elsewhere, to London through profits, or to the Cayman Islands through tax breaks or whatever. So in 2011, Preston Council brought in our organisation to try and do things differently. And together with Preston Council, my organisation and Preston Council said, instead of trying to attract inward investment from elsewhere, why don't we try and build wealth with the resources that we've already got here in Preston? And what they had in Preston is what we in the United Kingdom call anchor institutions, like an anchor of a ship. And what we mean by anchor institutions are big organizations that are rooted in place, that aren't going to go anywhere, that are always going to be in Preston. And the question is, how can those anchor institutions generate wealth for the local economy? And why Preston was a good place to do this is that actually Preston had some big anchor institutions. It had a council, it had some schools, it had a university, which is obviously big. It had police, it had a hospital, those anchor institutions. And so we began a scheme of work to try and keep money in the local economy through those anchor institutions. And that work about keeping money in a local economy through anchor institutions is what we call community wealth building. And community wealth building is a movement that started in America in the 2000s, and then we brought it over to the UK in 2011 in Preston, and now it's all over the place and everywhere. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you what community wealth building is about, then tell you what happened in Preston, and then tell you what's, since the work in Preston, been happening elsewhere. So community wealth building, as I said, is really about trying to create wealth in the local economy through the work of anchor institutions, and do so in a way that promotes social, economic, and environmental justice. So the first way that you can begin to keep wealth in the local economy through anchor institutions is through, in the bottom corner, progressive procurement of goods and service. What's the Swedish for procurement? Right, so it's spending from public sector institutions. And what we found in Preston was that the anchor institutions in Preston had enormous procurement power between them. And that ranged from the chairs that were in the council building, or the pens, all the way up to the procurement of big things like care or education provision. So anchor institutions have enormous procurement power, but what we found is that the government regulation was essentially saying, well, just buy the cheapest thing possible. Whatever it is, just buy cheap. That's all that matters. And what we did with Preston is we said, but actually, no, this is democratic money that's being spent on behalf of the public. And the way that it's being spent, it should get a good price, of course. It should be high quality, but also shouldn't it be spent with providers who are actually providing benefit for the local economy? And so what we started doing with the anchors in Preston is we started trying to shift the way that they did procurement so that they were trying to do less procurement with big major national organizations and do more procurement with small businesses, local businesses, charities, social enterprises, NGOs, cooperatives, and all the sorts of organizations that you probably represent. Now, as you'll know, and I think there are other talks on it coming today, under EU procurement laws, which still apply to the UK, at least for another few weeks, when you write a procurement decision, you can't say, we want a local firm, because it's against competitive practice. There's some nods in the room from procurement type people. But what you can do is, in the United Kingdom anyway, is you can say, well, on top of the contract, we want whoever's supplying to provide social value. And what we mean by social value here in Preston is that you will employ local people, maybe through apprenticeships, or that you will have zero carbon in your supply chains, or that you will pay your workers the living wage. I don't know if you have the living wage concept here in Sweden, but essentially we have a minimum wage in the UK. That's the lowest possible rate you can pay by hour. If you work every day of the week on the minimum wage, you would still be in poverty. So it's not good enough. So what we've introduced in the UK, people in the charity sector, is this idea of the real living wage, which is a wage that's higher than the government's minimum that you can actually work on and be in poverty. So through procurement, you can begin to get the anchor institutions to change their behavior so that they only take with suppliers who pay the real living wage, who have low carbon or zero carbon in their supply chains, and who benefit the local economy. And so what we did in Preston was we worked with the anchor institutions to try and shift their procurement practices and put money back into the local economy. And the outcome of that, and I'll come back to the other work, is that over about 8 years in Preston, we saw about £70 million of procurement money that used to be spent with suppliers outside of Preston go back into the Preston economy by going through to suppliers. And we saw a wider 200 million procurement spend go back into the wider Lancashire economy, which is the area around Preston. It's the broader region that Preston is in. And that is an enormous amount of money to go back into a local economy that had previously been going to suppliers based in London, China, or the Cayman Islands, or somewhere else. And we identified that you can do, I think one of the local economic analysis might do similar work, I don't know, but you can begin to analyze the multiplier effect of that spend and see actually how all the way through the supply chains, it generates wealth for local people and local residents. And we do analysis on this all of the time, and we saw that it created about 1,600 jobs, and it upgraded 4,000 people's pay from the minimum wage to the real living wage. So that progressive procurement piece is really about getting anchor institutions to change their behaviors so that they take with more social suppliers and more local suppliers. Yes? Living wage. How big is the difference there? So the question, the difference between the minimum wage and the real living wage, it varies from place to place. So it's weighted depending on how expensive the place is. So in London, I think the minimum wage is £8 an hour, and the real living wage is £10.50 an hour. And I think the gap would probably be smaller in rural places. But I don't know the specifics. The living wage is, sorry, yeah, let's take one more. The living wage is an important point because particularly in rural areas, people are paid in cash, for example, and usually even if they're paid the minimum in cash, they'll still be in poverty with that minimum wage, essentially.
Okay. Another question about the procurement.
Yeah.
You said you can sort of bypass the EU law by introducing demands for social value or local value.
Yeah.
And this hasn't been challenged in the courts or something. You got away with that.
Yeah. So the government passed a piece of legislation in 2012 called the Social Value Act that said, when you do procurement, if you want to consider the social value of a procurement alongside the price and quality, you can. Now, the government did not expect anyone to actually use that legislation. They didn't really want to pass it because our government is all about price. But actually, a lot of people are using it now. And just one other point, the way it works in places, for example, is let's take Manchester City Council, so the city where I live in Manchester. Every single procurement that the council does, they have a social value officer who looks at the procurement, phones up the supplier, if it's catering or construction, and says, what social value are you offering? What are you going to do? And if the supplier says, well, I can do social value, but it will be more expensive, it will increase the cost, then they said, no, all right, we'll find someone else. So it's about forcing the behavior of suppliers. Does that answer the question? Okay. So I'll just explain the other pillars and then we'll come back to questions at the end. So, still talking slowly enough? Okay, good. So if the principle behind this piece on procurement is how can anchors benefit the local economy, you can begin to apply it to other things beyond procurement. So for example, fair employment and just labour markets, we basically mean work by that. So you might have it in some local economies here, but in lots of local economies in a place, in places in the UK, a large percentage of workers are employed in the public sector. So they work for hospitals, they work for schools, for example. And what we do with localities is you say, well, are those public sector bodies, the anchor institutions, are they giving their workers the best possible terms and conditions? So are they encouraging their workers to join a trade union? Are they making sure that their workers are paid the real living wage? And also, are they making sure that their workers come from the most disadvantaged areas in their places, rather than all coming from places that are wealthier? So I'll give you, and that's really important for urban-rural distinction. So for example, let me tell you about Gateshead, which is in the northeast. So Gateshead is in the northeast, it's near Newcastle, and they have a city. The council covers the city, Gateshead, and also the rural area. And we did some analysis of Gateshead Council's workforce, and we found they were basically employing no one from the rural parts of Gateshead. And when we asked why, they said, well, the majority of people in the rural areas, they might not have the skills because they're less likely to have gone to university, but also there aren't good enough bus services from the rural areas into Gateshead. And of course, we sympathise with the council there because that's about national policy, but we also had to say to the council, well, that's not quite good enough, is it? Because if you're a public body, you have a responsibility to make sure you take your workers from the most disadvantaged places and the most left behind places in inverted commas. So it's about working with anchor institutions to improve their workforce and work behaviour practices. And then again, same principle on land and assets. So I don't know the context here in Sweden, but basically the public sector in the UK used to own lots of land, and it's being sold off at an incredible rate in the United Kingdom. So in 2007, we bailed out our banks at an enormous cost. The total value of all the land privatization that's happened in the last 20 years, financially, is the cost of bailing out the banks 10 times. So it's the largest privatization in British history. We've been selling off land, selling off land, selling off land to private developers. And what we say in community wealth building is that anchor institutions shouldn't be selling off that land. They should be keeping it in the democratic public economy. And they should be either using it, or if they can't use it, they should be sharing it with their communities and with the community sector. And so this is about the democratic control over land and assets that are held by local authorities. So for example, in some rural towns in the UK, you'll have small areas of land next to train stations that the government's trying to sell because they're close down the train station. And what we say is actually the community should have the right to buy that X train station, and then they should have the right to do whatever they want with it. So it's sort of the community land trust movement. And I would imagine, I'm guessing that you're probably a bit more advanced on that here, on that democratic control of land and assets. No? Okay. But certainly we're not very good at it in the United Kingdom. And so that land and assets piece is about trying to get anchor institutions to keep their money, to keep their land and assets in the public sector. And that's also obviously particularly important in climate emergency. So we have particularly rural and coastal local authorities that are selling off bits of the coast to property developers to build hotels with no real consideration of its impact on local ecology and ecosystems. And we say, actually, that's not right. If you want to sell public land, then if you're going to sell it, then you need to sell it to an organization that isn't going to trash the environment, essentially. So on all three of those, you can see the same principle emerging. Anchor institutions don't just go for the cheapest option, but actually use what you've already got to try and generate wealth for local residents. And that applies really to two other areas that I'll tell you about. These are the last two principles of community wealth building. So finance, financial power. This really refers to the fact that lots of money flows through anchor institutions, and they don't really give enough consideration in many cases of how they spend it. So for example, in every small town in the United Kingdom, every city, all of the public sector workers will have a pension, and those pensions will be held by the local municipalities in pension funds. And again, the only thought really that's given at the moment to pension funds is just invest it in something that will get a return, because this is the taxpayers' money. And what we say, again, is that that money shouldn't be just invested in any old thing. It should be invested in the communities to whom those pension funds actually belong. And a good example of this is in the United States. There's a real movement now to get hospitals in smaller areas in the United States to invest their pension funds in renewable forms of energy, in small cooperatives. Because again, some of you might work in cooperatives. Renewable energy cooperatives, one of the main things that they need is access to capital. They need cash, and they need people who are going to invest in them in the first case. And so what we say to anchor institutions is, why don't you use some of your pension fund money to invest in renewable energy cooperatives, or invest in community banking initiatives, in small grassroots community initiatives. And it might be a bit riskier, and it might take a bit longer to get your returns, but actually, because this is democratic money, you should be investing in that, not investing in Shell or BP or oil companies of those kinds. And the last principle, and I don't use too much jargon here, but the last principle is that basically underlaying all of the other four principles is this idea of plural ownership of the economy. And what we essentially mean by that is democratizing the economy. So we believe in my organization in the UK that the real way underneath all of this, that you'll actually create wealth for local residents, local people, is if you give local people more control over how wealth is produced in the first place. If you give them democracy at work. So that's through worker cooperatives, that's through mutual associations, that's through businesses where workers actually own the business, social enterprises, small and medium enterprises. We want to see less of a country where everyone works for an Amazon or a Google or a big supermarket, and more of a country where more people work for small, locally owned businesses where they are both the workers and the owners. And so what we say is, if you're a really radical municipal government, you should be in everything you do, in your procurement, in your land and assets, in your workforce, in your finance, you should be seeking to democratize the local economy. So, for example, in Preston, we got the anchor institutions together, and we noticed that all of the anchor institutions were buying their food, for their canteens, from suppliers outside of Preston. And so we said to the anchors in Preston, why don't you all get together and help local people set up a food business that can then supply the anchor institutions? And not only that, why don't you ensure that that business is a cooperative? And so they did that. And so they set up a food cooperative. And there are other examples of that. So, for example, all of the anchor institutions have certain technology needs in Preston. Is there a way that you could try and set up a technology cooperative and then encourage the anchor institutions, again, in a legal way, encourage those anchor institutions to use those tech cooperatives? So what you're trying to do is you're trying to use the instruments available to local and municipal government to try and pluralize and democratize the local economy. And so that's played out in a number of ways in Preston. And what's particularly interesting in Preston is they've done it at scale. They've got all the anchor institutions involved, and it's benefiting not just Preston, but it's benefiting the small towns and rural areas around Preston as well, because we've always said to the council, this can't just be about the city centre, this has got to be the whole region. And in 2018, Preston was named the most improved place to live in the United Kingdom. And that's not all because of our work, of course, but it is part of this piece of work that Preston has led on and innovated on to try and keep wealth in the local economy and use anchor institutions to do that. So community wealth building is now a movement that's spread well beyond Preston in the United Kingdom. And these are just some of the places across the UK that are now taking on community wealth building approaches. And you'll notice that that's in all 4 nations of the United Kingdom. So England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. And it's also in all totally different types of places that all have different sort of economic challenges and different sort of economies. And just with my few minutes left before we open for questions, I'll tell you about a few of those. So we were talking about Preston, and we were talking about basically a left behind, deindustrialized, small city, big town in the northwest, where the problem is not enough investment, right? Well, what about somewhere the complete opposite, like the borough of Newham in London? Now, some of you might know Newham as the place where the Olympics happened, essentially, in 2012. And Newham is a place that is historically the poorest part of London, or one of the poorest parts in London. It's got predominantly migrant communities. And then the Olympics happened, and everyone in Newham was told, well, this is it, Newham is going to change, because when all of this investment comes, you're going to benefit. And actually, what's happened, surprise, surprise, is gentrification. The price of property has gone up, and actually, the changes since the Olympics haven't benefited the people who already lived in Newham. They've benefited the hipsters who are now moving to Newham and gentrifying it. So community wealth building through anchor institutions in Newham is got a different flavour to Preston, because it's more about using anchor institutions to try and defend the residents there from some of the problems of gentrification. And it's about saying that actually we, the people who already live in Newham, we're the ones who should benefit from the Olympic legacy and from growth. And that includes, for example, so Newham is one of the last places that's got, they're doing council house building. So they're building social housing through the council in Newham, and they're doing so in a community wealth building way. So their procurements, when they build their council housing, is with small local businesses, is with co-ops, is with mutuals, is with those sorts of organizations. And they're also, in their relationship with big business, they're being more forceful. So there's a big new development in Newham called the Royal Docks Enterprise Zone, which just sounds, very businessy. And what Newham Council is now doing more than before is they're saying to the big private companies who develop on this land, well, you can do this, but you can't do this. And, you can build here, right? We're not against inward investment, but if you want to, you need to do certain things, like, for example, pay the real living wage or take certain environmental factors into consideration. So community wealth building here, it's about being more forceful with the forces of inward investment and using municipal power to try and defend local residents. Now I'll take you again somewhere completely different, North Ayrshire, up in Scotland, very rural area. quite a remote area, and maybe actually of all the places I've discussed, resembles some of the places that you represent we're talking about here today. No real industry since the 70s in North Ayrshire, for example. And what they do have is lots of small businesses, family-owned businesses. And those family-owned businesses, like most family-owned businesses in the United Kingdom, they usually have 5 to 9 employees, and they're run, like most small businesses in the UK, by baby boomers, by people in their 60s who are coming up for retirement age. And so the question is, what's going to happen to all of those businesses when all of those people retire? And we know from evidence that what usually happens to those businesses is that they either get sold to bigger businesses or they close. And so what we're doing with North Ayrshire is based on that plural ownership of the economy principle. We're saying to them, can you work with the workers in those businesses to try and buy out their owners when the owners retire, so that they can take them over and turn them into worker cooperatives? Can you work with the existing small business base to try and flex it, to make it more resilient and democratic and sustainable in the long term? So again, North Ayrshire, very different to Newham, very different to Preston, but the same principles about using the role of anchor institutions to try and generate wealth for local economies. I'm not going to go through all of these, but just to say, we're at a stage now with community wealth building where it's sort of like, I don't know if it's probably a phrase, it's gone viral, like it's trendy for economic development. We've now got major political parties in the United Kingdom committed to this. So the Labour Party, which might be in government next week, it might not, who knows? They've got a community wealth building unit where they now look at community wealth building policies and think about what it might mean for national legislation. The Scottish National Party, who are in government in Scotland, are also looking at this. And the Welsh government, which is Labour run in Wales, is also looking at this. So these ideas are really now beginning to spread across the UK, because there's been a reawakening in the UK through this work of municipal spirit, of local government spirit. And that's not just in cities like Preston, but it's also in very small towns. There's been this sense in the last few years that national government has let us down and left us behind so badly that actually we have to go back to local government and district government to try and reanimate our economies and our democracy. And just to end by saying that the work in Preston, the very technical work around procurement, is now also being applied in an EU context. So the EU has run for the last few years URBACT, which is this sort of innovation work. And these are a number of cities that are working with Preston now to try and develop community wealth building techniques. So it's a movement that's really growing and spreading. And I think that there are great lessons for here in Sweden. And it'd be really interesting now to hear sort of comments and questions, and particularly how you think some of this might apply over here, because some of it might and some of it might not. But it'd be really interesting for me anyway, just to hear some questions and comments. Yeah?
Maybe we could start with
Perfect. Just to waken you up a bit. We can help each other with the questions, so they can tell the questions in Swedish,
yeah.
And we can translate. Vi får fråga på både engelska och svenska, det går bra. Det är svårt att översätta. Har vi gett lite närmare så hör vi dig.
Your ideas and goals in your organization, it must be totally contrary to your government's ideas and goals. Don't you have a lot of resistance against your work? Because the government has, I think, many opportunities to hinder your work.
Yeah, I think the basic answer is yes, in that we are trying to do economics in a different way, essentially, that national government doesn't particularly approve of. But what's interesting about that is there is a certain way of telling the Preston story, for example, that calls it like local socialism, and is, you know, it's a big approved idea of Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party. So it's very left wing, which the government doesn't like. But there's also another way of telling this story, which is about making use of the resources that we've already got, about being thrifty, about saying the thing about procurement is you're always going to have to spend that money. So let's do it in a productive way. So there are different ways of bending and flexing the language so that it should appeal to everyone. It's common sense, really. It's about using the resources we've got to generate local well-being in local economies. But you're right, we've got a particularly difficult government at the moment in the UK. Sorry, less so in Scotland and Wales.
How do you think the rural economies of the UK will be affected by Brexit?
That's a great question. I think it's badly is the answer, but I think it's tricky because there is, in some of this, there's a my organisation is not pro-Brexit, right? We don't have a view on it, but you can see how some of this could go along the sort of protectionist Brexit line, right? Which is basically everyone in Preston spends money in Preston, everyone in this small area spends money in this small area. We don't see it that way, because this is not about spending money for the sake of it. This is not about just valorizing the concept of local spend because local is inherently better. This is about saying the way that you spend your money and develop your economy should benefit local people, and it should reduce rather than increase vast regional inequalities that we've got in the UK. And if that means more local suppliers, then maybe it does. But you can be a local supplier and be rubbish. And you can be a supplier from London or somewhere else and be really good for the local economy. So it's not that local is inherently better. But on that's the broader point. On Brexit specifically, I think that it's really tricky because many rural areas which voted Brexit are actually reliant on EU funding. You know, places like the south of Wales, for example. You know, in some places in the Welsh valleys, you'll have, you know, 80% of the people voted to leave the EU, and you'll drive along roads and go into hospitals that say paid for with EU funding. So it's going to be a real challenge for those places. Who knows what will happen? I don't know, but it's not going to be good.
So I was wondering how you think that the Swedish rural localities will bypass the regional ones, because in Sweden, as it is today, we have a lot of strict bureaucratic structures, which tells us that we need to have all procedures made regionally and even sometimes on a global level with the EU. So how do you think that the localities will be able to apply this kind of concept, and how will we bypass all these bureaucratic needs? How will we do that in Sweden, perhaps?
Yeah, I think that the way that we found that the answer to that in the UK is it takes a democratic movement, and it takes good local leadership. So all of the work that's happened in Preston, in Europe, anywhere else, has had strong leaders who aren't just drawing up the drawbridge and saying Preston for Preston or Newham for Newham or whatever, but they are saying to national government or regional government, they're saying our relationship is currently a bad balance of power, because if there's ever a problem, it's in Preston, and if anyone ever succeeds in Preston, they move down to London. So that and what we're going to do in a fair and democratic way is reset that relationship, and we're going to take matters into our own hands a little bit. So it's a sort of like friendly but forceful democratic exercise where you say, well, actually, you say to national government, look, you failed us. We're going to have to take matters into our own hands slightly. We're happy to work with you, but we need to, we need to do something different to what's already happening in this country. I don't know, that might be more or less applicable here, but that's what we found in the UK.
Har vi en fråga längst ner och sen en där framme?
Yes, thank you a lot for a fantastic presentation. As head of the local government, I'm very pleased to hear how we could use this money. We spend approximately 30 million euros per year and we built a house with 24 apartments just a couple of 100 meters from here that opened this year. We paid approximately 4 million euros. We used only local carpenters, except one from Bournemouth, which is like 60 miles.
Bournemouth in the UK.
Yeah,
it's very nice there. Yeah.
So, what my question to you is, what do you think the local government should prioritize when you go to the procurement business locally?
That's a great question. I think that it's about being sensitive to the local market, essentially, because we have to be realistic with this work, which is that you need to get good quality stuff at a reasonable price, essentially. So it's about knowing what the local market could respond to. So when we work with a council, we first of all, we don't say to them, everything procure locally. We do analysis of the sectors in a local economy, and we work out which sectors it might be appropriate to procure more locally, and which sectors actually you might need to get a supplier from London, for example. Then, once you've identified the sectors where you can procure locally, you go and speak to those businesses, and you have a look at their environmental codes, you have a look at their workforce codes, you have a look at all of these things, and you one by one begin to push the little bits of practice that you can push. You don't do it all at once, otherwise you'll scare the local markets, essentially, and they won't be able to respond to the things that you're asking them to do. So it's about a gradual, sequential approach, essentially. Does that answer your question? Good.
Då går vi vidare med nästa, sen har vi 2 där och så sen har vi en den, så du får stå på kö till dess.
2 questions. I work with the transition movement locally in Sweden.
Yeah.
What's the relation between what you are doing and the transition movement? It sounds that it's very similar in some ways. What is your work? Is it should be regarded as some part of a bigger transition movement?
What do you want to? About the Green New Deal? Yes. So it's my fault for not addressing this enough in the presentation. We see this work entirely as sitting within the Green New Deal and the transition movement in the UK and in local economies. And of course, most of you will know what that is essentially. But what we need in the UK, we decided what we need in the UK is a big movement, is we need a plan for every region in the UK that says, in the age of climate emergency, these are the sectors that you're going to move towards as the big employment sectors in your locality. And these are the sectors you're going to move away from. And of course, the sectors we're moving to are zero carbon, renewable energy, those sorts of things. And this approach entirely sits within that and is a means to implement it. Because what you do in this approach is you essentially say, in a locality, we're going to stop measuring the success of this locality by its GDP, by its gross domestic product. And we're going to start measuring it by well-being of local people and also by how quickly we can begin to transition our local economy, essentially, towards zero carbon. And so we see this community wealth building work as part of that bigger piece that's transitioning local and regional economies in the age of climate crisis. And little bits like this, procurement and all of those, they're levers that you can pull to try and make that happen and try and speed it up. So yeah, we're very linked into that.
Yeah. Very, very short and very short in your answers.
Okay.
And you are about to take a part of your fika time, but if you find it interesting, I'm prepared to let it go like that. We have like 3 more questions. So just to be clear, it's your own coffee, but it's interesting. So short answer, short.
Pressure.
you just did.
Yes, sorry. It's very, very nice to have Ylva. Afterwards, you will have time to deepen your thoughts in these different areas, to talk directly in groups to these different persons. Alltså ni får prata med föreläsarna öga mot öga på eftermiddagen, det som kallas gruppsessionen eller fördjupningsarbeten eller så vidare. Så vi försöker titta lite grann. Den ni vill ta i stor grupp, ja. Annars kan ni gå in och ägna en timme eller en halvtimme så och prata i lugn och ro senare. Är ni med? Ja. Bra. Nu får du bestämma om du vill lägga din fråga nu eller inte.
We have governments who sign treaties, international treaties, and the companies come and say, if we can't start a mine in your town, you will have to pay how much money because they have. And how do you really can you be protected against this kind of international money?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll give a brief answer on that. You can try your best through legislation, but the local municipalities we work with, what we say to them and what they do is that if you lose a fight, if you're losing a fight against a big multinational, then that's where you need to be a bit more like an activist and take up that democratic campaigning role where you say, I, the leader of the local council, I've been elected with a mandate from the people to increase economic and environmental and social justice, and I'm not going to accept this, and if I can't win through legislation, then we'll go to court. So it's that stronger representation of local interests from local government that might lead you into conflict. So I'll get one quick example. Again, Newham Council in an age of massive cuts were being charged huge interest on loans that they had taken out by banks. And the new leader of the council said, well, look, we have a choice between feeding the people we need to feed and paying bank loans. So as a human rights issue, I'm not paying the loans. And that went to the High Court and she ended up winning, and Newham Council ended up winning. So it's about being a bit stronger and a bit more forceful in the exercise of democratic local power.
Ni som har frågor kvar vill ställa dem nu. Antingen har jag lyckats alldeles jättebra eller katastrofalt. Jag vet inte. Jag har lite en hemlighet till också här alldeles innan vi går på väg till fika. Jag tänker helt enkelt göra så. Vi skyndar vidare i schemat. I'm going to cut this.
Okay.
A bit of democracy here. Yeah. Though I said in the beginning that I'm in charge and so on. I hope these discussions will continue and that you will stay with us, and as I said, you will have more opportunities. But for now, and thank you for this very nice presentation, who I hope everybody else in Sweden also have watched the website. Yeah. Local product, as the other got, tomato with vodka from Järvsö. Wow. Järvsö is the local name of Järvsö. Yeah. So pronounce it either way you like. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.